Well, hey, I'm Aiden. I'm here with Dan, Greg, and Sherry, and we've been going through the book of Ephesians here at the Norton Campus of Grace. And as we've been going through that second half of the book, there's a lot of practical parts. And so last week we talked about marriage and kind of sat down with you and your wife, Dan, and kind of talked about just the nuts and bolts of marriage, just the questions that sometimes you want to ask while the preacher's preaching, but it's not the right venue. So we kind of wanted to sit around the table and just have conversation. And so, Greg, you're pastor of family ministries. Sherry, you're the director of Power Kids and Children's Ministry here at Norton. But you guys are also parents, and you have families, and you are also children. And so we kind of want to first and foremost stop there with you guys. But I think about this, every family is different, right? No two families are the same. Everybody's got their own baggage and their own experiences, their own traditions, their own quirks. And so we're talking to people that are coming from all across the map, right? Blended family, like all kinds of different things. And so I'm kind of the young parent here trying to figure out some of these things. And so while we were sitting in the sermon on Sunday, Dan was telling just some of his stories, kids not listening, crazy stuff. And my wife under breath keeps going, "Oh, that's so good to hear." She kept saying, "Oh, I'm so glad that it brought comfort knowing that you guys had a bunch of fails too." But I'd love to hear this, kind of break down this third wall. Do you guys have any good parenting failing stories as you were raising kids, stories that just level the field with everybody?
I'm dying to hear this too, man.
So I'd answer which one. So the one that comes to mind is my kids were probably early middle school. And here in the Summit County, we have the fall hiking spree. And so the fall hiking spree is you go so many different hikes, and if you get, I think it's 9 or 10 trails, you get a walking stick. So my wife and I were like, we're going to do this as a family. We're going to get walking sticks, and we're going to go. So the first, I think it's Labor Day started. We were there Labor Day, the first trail. And after that, we had it mapped out where we were going to next. So after that, then every week we'd have a different trail. Well, then the first one, it was kind of like, why are we doing this? And then the second week was like, we couldn't even get in the van. Like, I don't want to do this. I wish I would have a picture to show when we did finally finish it, but the whole time, and we'll probably talk about this later, but it's that influence control. It was right at that point where I realized, okay, I can't control my kids to do the hikes like I used to. But we did finish it. We have our 4 sticks, and we've never been back on the fall hiking spree. But that one season,
that was punctuated it forever.
We rocked it.
There is such a ideal in your head, and then when you get there, this was a lot different in my head than how this played.
Well, other families were walking and smiling, and my kids are like,
"Oh."
Well, mine is very young, so I wanted to follow all the books and say. I was consistent in all that I did, and so I had a 2-year-old little girl that she didn't want to sit in the chair for a timeout, and so I wanted her to sit in the chair for a timeout, and so I would put her down, she'd pop up, I put her down, and so I held her there. And, I'm going to hold you there until it's, 2 minutes past and I'm holding her there. I'm crying, she's crying, it's like, and I look at the clock and it was like, I walked away and it was like, oh, I don't know who won. It's very sad.
You say something out loud.
Very consistent.
Yeah, you say that loud. Like, well, now I have to commit to this thing I said 10 minutes ago.
It's amazing as a parent, I think, how I was an expert at parenting before I had kids.
That's what I was going to say.
You know what I mean?
Oh.
It's amazing how this is the way I would do it.
Oh, man.
And then the minute I remember we brought Joel home. I thought, man, this is awesome. We got our family. And we put him in that little buggy beside the bed, and we're going to go to sleep, and we go to sleep. And the dude cried all night long. And I think about the third night, I thought to myself, what did we do, But every stage of your parenting, I think, gives us opportunities for you to okay, I'm learning on the job. I think that's parenting.
Yeah.
You just learn on the job.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think about sitting around the table. I have a 2-year-old, 2.5, 5-year-old. Your kids are about a decade older than that. Then your guys' kids are about a decade older than that. And then we get to where it kind of flips, and then I'm the closest child to the next parents, and so it kind of
said we're old. I'm not sure,
but I said it very kindly, and very, you got to learn how to say it. One of the things, so I experienced the same thing. So bring my first kid home 5 years ago, and you hear a bunch of people talk about parenting, steering kids towards Jesus, and you're like, yeah, I'll just read this every night. And what are some of the ways, Dan, you talked Sunday about kind of this training up a child in the way they should go. What are just some of the ways that you guys kind of nurtured an environment that helped Jesus make sense? Because exactly like you're saying, there's no manual that you do it and all goes perfect. You said Sunday kids are jumping off the bed, trying to read a story. What were some of the things you guys did intentionally as you kind of nurtured, trained up your kids that helped create that environment for the gospel to make sense to them?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it was like obviously we read different things, and you get these ideas and like the perfect scenarios. But then you realize what's real life, what's your family, and so what we just did, it was just like, okay, what works for us in this season? It's like you read these books. It's like we have family devotions, and we sit down and la la la. What we just did, it's like let's talk about Jesus at this phase, at this stage, and then because they're going to catch so much of who we are just by how we act, and so because the videotape's constantly on. Like it's a 24-hour surveillance. They're always watching us, and so if I'm saying one thing and doing another, they'll be the first to pick up on that. So just being consistent, and when I'm inconsistent, I own it.
That's good.
It was good. Yeah, I as a kid, I would go to Jesus all the time. I would run to the restroom to have my conversation with God. When I felt like I needed to be alone. And I kind of brought that into with my kids when my brother wanted me to pray. There was some things that were happening. He wanted to pray. And so I would grab their tiny little hands and we would pray together. And it's like, we need to pray for Uncle Randy, or we need to and just making them understand that Jesus was so real to me that I could go to him no matter what. And so it's like, even them now grown, I still, we have an app that we all communicate through, and it's like, okay, I need you to help me pray, for whatever this is. And it's like, it's just really been my connection, with them.
I love what you guys are saying. Like, I think about that 24-hour surveillance. I love that way of thinking. I've been a pastor for 30 years, and I'm thinking about the people who come in my office. When they talk about their parents, I can't think of a single person that's ever talked about devotion they did, and those are good to do. Like, hey, I remember when we did this particular devotion. They always talk about, I remember watching Mom and Dad growing up, the modeling, and they always talk about the time, the concentrated time that those people spent with them. And so that has been something as I think about this. Like we sit them down and do stories when they're little. And then eventually that crosses, and I want them to be spending time. But I think about probably the most important thing that you do is model for them the realness of Jesus in your life. I think kids can see right through inauthenticity. They can just see right through it. And so the way I would treat Jennifer and the way she would respond to me, all that stuff becomes key. I wanted our children, Aiden, to there's two things that I remember going back. I wanted them to know God was really, really big. Really, really big. So when I read Deuteronomy 6, like, he's big. So he's big enough we can trust him. Like, we can take steps and trust him. But I wanted them to know he wasn't just big, he was unbelievably loving. And that he cared about them. And so when you have so that happens in Bible time for sure. But it has to happen in conversation. It has to show up in the way they see you rolling out your life. Because I can tell them God's big, but they're watching to see how big God is, right? And so I love the 24-hour surveillance imagery. I think that's so true. They take pictures and snapshots, and they're watching. And I think that's one of the best ways to cultivate that. I really do.
There's probably a sense of that, which I think you're totally right, that kids can kind of sniff out if something's inauthentic, you know what I mean? Like, it's like their meter is like, yeah, that's not real. Probably even more so as each generation goes. Like, my kids are probably gonna have a more sensitive meter than I did because there's so much now. You know what I mean? So you can just like, that's not helpful, that's not real. So finding the real thing is probably more and more just acute in people's lives. Yeah. Yeah. Are there even, maybe just like the nitty gritty of it, are there certain resources that are helpful? Sometimes someone recommends a Bible, or maybe, hey, here's this app, or here's whatever, and you try stuff, and you're like, okay, that didn't, because like you said, Greg, every phase, but then also every kid is just the way they react. That's what, I was the best parent I was ever going to be before my kid was born. And as soon as they were born, me and my wife are both fifth borns. So we have a firstborn kid. We're both like, what do you do with the firstborn when you're fifthborn? Man? It's like, just chill out, bro. So it's just different. And so different things work for different people. Are there resources that were most helpful for you guys? Whether it's a resource or just a whatever that was most helpful for you guys in this?
One of the things that we did, I mean, when the kids were early on, like obviously we had, there's a Bible called the Jesus Storybook Bible, and we read that for that phase. But we also just had great music that taught scripture, and so it was like it wasn't like the annoying music, but it's just like the catchy stuff, and the kids are just picking up on scripture. And so as they're growing older, it's like, oh, that makes sense. And so we're just listening, we're cleaning the house. Also, it's like, but they're memorizing, listening to. And we have that even here with Power Kids. Sherry has the Spotify playlist that they play so families can listen to that throughout the week in the van rides and all that stuff. So that's for us. We just tried to not only what we read, but also what we listened to, what we're watching on TV or tablets, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say music as well. We would have some issues with nightmares and different things. And it's like, I remember one of them coming to me and saying, I saw this and I can't get it out of my head. And it's like, do not fear, for I am with you. Do not, and just kind of, singing that, getting something else in your head.
Yeah.
And, having God's word. And all of a sudden, we're singing a song before we go to bed, But it's interesting. There's been even different parents in Power Kids that have asked, what do you do when your kid is afraid? And it's like, I only know what I did, you know, and these are the resources. And there's great resources. There's apps and there's Bibles and there's devotionals and stuff. I would say it's really, every kid is so different, whether they're visual or, musically, whatever. But it's like, you just got to figure out your child. But there's stuff, there's lots.
There's a lot of guess and check. Sometimes it can be easy to, I don't have the right book or the right app, so I'm not sure. But just trying stuff and seeing what they attach to.
When it comes to resources for parents, like basically how to parent, there's a lot, right, of resources that probably we could give you a list of. I think of two things, and then there's caveats to them. Like, so there's all kinds of books, Shepherding a Child's Heart kind of books, things like that. You can find. I think that's a great resource. Books, podcasts about parenting that are gospel-centered. I think another great resource is the community of believers.
Yeah.
I think trying to parent alone, it can be really hard. But to find a community where it's safe to do it together and where there's a security, the caveats to those are this. You gotta be careful, the parenting resource, we had the same, that you're not trying to parent your kid into a program.
Yeah.
It has to supplement what you're doing. It has to, how is my kid bent? Because if you're trying to program somebody, you're going to totally miss how that kid's bent. And you're going to have all kinds of frustration, exasperation. We had a book like that too, and we got exasperated with it. And I finally came home and, where is that thing? I took it and threw it away. I'm like, we're done with it. And the thing about the community of believers, find that huddle and be careful not to compare.
Right.
Just be careful not to compare. Like, it's amazing how you guys remember that when your kids are little, the things that are so, is your kid walking yet? Oh, we must be terrible parents. They still got a pacifier? Yeah. Oh, what did I do wrong? You compare.
Yeah.
Well, nobody cares when they get older. What age did they get rid of it? But a group that you can, like, pray together, love their kids together, all that kind of stuff, I think is important. Resource.
It's huge.
And also part of the body of Christ too. It's like finding somebody who's maybe a phase or two ahead of you. So you realize, okay, I'm going through this phase, and am I as crazy as I think I am? And somebody just went through it recently. Like, oh, I am normal. That helps. That's the cool thing about the body of Christ.
You're normal, Aiden.
See?
You are normal.
Totally.
That's the first time anybody's ever said that. I think this is something that everybody probably feels, that we've been in a huge communication shift, like from now, like having to have conversations with kids that you didn't have to have maybe when you guys were kids, you know what I mean? And parents probably, I was just talking to a parent on Sunday that was like asking us questions. How do you navigate your kid goes to school, what decisions do you make about media? How do you talk to kids about certain sexuality conversations? How do you know? There's so much. What would you say to parents that are just navigating some of that waters, the waters of like making decisions in regards to media, to conversations, to kind of the we all as adults feel the kind of choppiness of the cultural waters going on. And then you have kids, and sometimes just talking to my own peers and parents are like, what do we do with all this? Somebody might say, you got to do this for school. You got to, and there feels like, am I supposed to do that? What would you say to parents that are maybe looking at the cultural landscape and being like, how do I parent through all this?
Well, one of the things that my kids were kind of just going into that phase, they didn't get phones until much later because it wasn't the culture at the time. But I remember there was a conversation that was going back and forth with one of my kids and somebody at school. And it was getting to be drama and all this kind of stuff. And I just wanted to stop it. I wanted to figure out how I could just block it. And so I went on Verizon's website, and I'm like, how do I block this? And it was fascinating to me that Verizon said, and I'm like, I'm getting it from Verizon, it's better to have conversations with your child before you. And I was just like, really? You had to tell me that.
You didn't say that for one of the resources. It's Verizon's Q&A section on their website.
Yeah. But it was like, I need to have a conversation. And it's like, instead of trying to control and block and do all this kind of stuff, it's like, okay, I need to navigate them through what is happening and why this is tough. And it's like, yeah. I have to be reminded of that often, because it's like when things are going rough or bad or however you think, our first response is when it was little, we had more control. When they start going out and you don't have less control, it's like, you want to pull that back. And it's like, that's not what we're called to do. We're empty nesters. That's the goal, is to empty nest, but they need resources themselves.
But when they're young, to use your analogy, when they're young, like I'm sitting here thinking as you're talking, I think there can be a tendency when they're little to release control too soon, to give them access too soon, and they're not made to handle certain things. We don't let a kid drive a car till they're 16. There's a reason for that. They're not made to handle the car till they're 16. And so one of the things I thought the way you worded the question and just listening, it's like, if I want to get to that place, I got to kind of navigate some of those things. I'm thinking social media, things like that. Like as a young child, if I just have free reign and I'm getting this volumes of whatever, I'm not made to handle that. I'm not made to be discerning for that. Whereas I'm hoping when I'm 15, 16, I'm not just shutting controls off and pulling levers, but that I'm able to talk to my child through it. They're made to have that conversation. And so, I do think there's a caution there that, we as parents, I think when they're little, have that opportunity to kind of measure out what is appropriate, what they're able to hold,
Yeah, and I think, the Facebook came out in 2005, and so the graduating senior class this year, they've grown up with being like on screens, and so iPhone came out in 2007, so all the students who are freshmen or younger, all they know is life with an iPhone. Mm-hmm. So like we're parenting in this generation we've never been parented before. Our parents never had to deal with it. So even like some of you guys are on the cusp of all that, but now like we're in the middle of it all. So how to help navigate those conversations. And it just goes back to what you said. It's like, okay, we're going to say no to this, but the same kind of thing with driving the car. We don't just, when you turn 16, here's the keys. What do you have to do? How many hours of drive time? How many tests you have to go through to sit with an instructor? So whatever device you're giving them or whatever YouTube stuff, so knowing where they're at, walking alongside and help coaching them. And that, like we go back to every kid's different. So, the oldest did it this way, so they got their phone this day. So why couldn't I get my phone there? It's not fair. We just go back to, it's not about fair. We're about just sharing how to disciple our kids.
Yeah, so that's kind of interesting you said. it's so easy to get caught in this. I'm trying to be fair.
Right.
As a parent, you really don't want to be fair. You want to be wise.
Right.
You want to be right? You want to, I want to help you in the right path. I don't want to just be fair because that might not be the right path. And I was thinking about the gospel according to Verizon, right? Which is what we're going to do, right? Like, the power of that is they told you to talk to your. Jesus said something interesting that I always thought with my kids, like out of the overflow of your heart, the mouth speaks. The more you can create a environment where your kids are talking, you get to hear what's in their heart.
Right.
And so I can shut your phone off, but I want to know actually what's going on in your heart, right? And I think if you can create that environment, and as they get older, there's going to be pockets of time where they're going to resist that.
And just know there's going to be battles over technology. That's part of.
Just say it.
I mean,
now.
just know no matter what you choose, it's never the right thing, and everybody else is la la la. Got it. So just know there's going to be battles ahead. If you have not hit them yet, you will.
That's coming from a guy who's been working with teenagers for a lot of years, and now he has his own teenagers.
Yeah.
I have a 2-year-old who's Coco. It's Coco Melon. He's like Coco. Like, are you the flu? He just wants Coco Melon. It almost goes full circle. So you think about, you said, which is true, I was a junior in high school when the iPhone came out, and almost parenting on the other side, just as we said early on with creating an environment that, I don't remember the devotionals my parents taught me, but I remember watching them. You take that full circle is to teach about technology or how to engage with people that we love but disagree with, how we talk about people that we have differences with. They're watching all those things. So as you navigate the cultural waters, just from hearing what you guys are saying, there's answers that need to be said. There's at certain ages when they're under, your control more, things that need shut off, conversations that need had. But they're watching. If I spend my whole time parenting from my phone and then I'm like, you need to get off your phone, they're like,
Yep.
Being a chump dad, and so they're kind of turns that around all of that. Like how I'm being formed in parenting is all there. Yeah, absolutely. You guys kind of talked about it, and Dan, you talked about the Sunday, but there is that control influence thing that when you're young, I have a 2 and 5-year-old, there's a lot of control. There's like, go to bed, shut the door, you're done. Whereas later on, there starts to be influence, or the more you try to control, the more you're going to push them away, right? And you said Sunday, Dan, there's at some point where that kind of crosses. Are there certain things that maybe in your own parenting or maybe just in your ministry with people, how do you know when you're kind of approaching that spot? You said it's different for everybody, but how do you know when you're kind of, maybe parents that have kids in middle school and stuff where it's like, is this a control situation or is this an influence situation? How do you know when you start, I'm not really experiencing that right now. We're all control here in the Coco Melon phase. But how do you know when it's time to control or time to influence? Because I'm sure we've all had high school parents that are like, can you tell my kids to do this? And you're like, no, they're 17, man. What would you say to that?
I mean, it goes back to that story I said at the front end. Like, we tried to do that hike. Like, if I would have tried to do that hike 5 years earlier, I would have been all about it. But all of a sudden, it's like they're in that middle school phase, and they both they rarely ever were together. But that moment, it was like, we're just going to be together. But I think you just find, like, when that period of time comes, you just start embracing and going back to what you did and being that consistent voice. Because it's so easy to be like, well, I'm going to change my parenting. Well, you have to adjust and pivot, but you're still going to follow Jesus, because it goes back to, we talked about the video still being played. Like, is mom and dad's faith still the real deal now that I'm in this phase? Because all of a sudden they're going to be run to this sport or this play, this thing. It's like, what's the most important thing in my life? It's like mom and dad say Jesus, but it's like, we can miss church, we can miss youth group, or we can miss Power Kids, which I'm not saying that that's not a bad thing to be a part of things. But when that becomes more of the priority, then all of a sudden the kids the film is playing. It's like, oh, mom and dad. But as you have influence in their life, they'll start seeing what's truly important and how we act and what we live for.
Good.
Parents, conflict with parents create weird allies with siblings, don't they? Huh?
Oh, totally.
That's interesting. I think back to that picture in, like, well, let's state the obvious. The picture it is an idealistic picture. By that I mean,
Sure.
It assumes when you're going to start off this desire for control, and then eventually they're hearing your voice. I think you gotta, as the kids are growing up in a loving environment where there's security, you're speaking identity. So you gotta keep saying to them, you aren't who they say you are. You're not even who you say you are. You are who God says you are. Mm-hmm. In that environment, you gotta set up almost learning labs. A kid has to have the opportunity as they grow. In those labs, they change in terms of their risk. So where you will say, let me give you a really stupid one. Like, my wife and I would go back and forth on this, but when the boys were a certain age, she'd get after him. You need to put your hat on. And she watches this. You're like, you're going to catch cold. And eventually I said, you need to tell him, hey, it's cold out. I'd put a hat on and leave it go. Because the deal is this, you don't put your hat on, eventually your ears are freezing. It's like, well, guess what?
Yeah.
Right? And little by little to let that line out, because all of a sudden the stakes get higher as they get older, right? And then, because we're parenting to independence, right? That's what we're experiencing. Independence is what you want. So you want them to stand on their own 2 feet. The way you do that is give them opportunities to stand on their own 2 feet. But it assumes here, they're recognizing a voice. I can remember one of my adult kids coming to me. They were kind of in adulthood. They were kind of in that weird going
full influence.
And they told me what they were going to do. And they're like, I'm going to tell you, Mom, this is what I'm going to do. And they sat us down and told us what they were going to do. And I remember thinking as they're talking, my wife was as white as a sheet of paper. She was just white. And I remember thinking, this is crazy. But they said, I just want to tell you guys, I'm not here to ask for advice. I'm just here to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm like, so I just kept smiling and looking at them, and they got done. And I thought, this is going to blow up. And I just looked at them and I said, we're going to support you however we can, however we feel we can, pray for you. And then I let a weird pregnant pause, and I said, would you like my opinion? And thankfully, in this case, they said yes, right? Yeah. But if they had said no, I don't want, right there with the age, I'm like, okay,
yeah,
here we go. But I think you got to give them little labs, Yeah. It's like training wheels. Now let's go on around a little bit. Yeah. And, here's the way I would do it. I would do it my own way. Okay. Oh, now we got a scrape on the knee. I wouldn't have done it that way.
Yeah.
Right? But give them those while they're in the safety net.
Right.
Where they're going to be loved through it, taught through it, I think is important.
That's funny. Like I said, I'm closer to being the time when I was in my home with my parents than you guys were, right? It was closer.
Another reference to our age.
I'm just saying. I remember almost that exact conversation. I remember there was a kid who lived up the street, and almost there was always kind of it was a nice kid, but always conflict with the parents. You're like, why is there always conflict? He's a nice kid. Like, there's always this tension. I remember being in the car with my mom and her explaining to me just exactly that. That if you make arbitrary rules just to be in control, when your kid crosses from the control to influence, it's like they're going to know that it's arbitrary. And they're going to not fight back against you as a parent, but fighting back against this arbitrary rule. I was the last of 5 boys. So it's like guess and check. You're like, all right, we got a little bit of... So there was not a ton of rules, but the rules that they had were for my benefit. There was like, you couldn't go in the woods when it was windy. You couldn't. And I had more of that trust, and it made sense because it didn't seem like they were trying to arbitrarily control me. And she explained that to me kind of through the lens of the gospel. God doesn't make arbitrary rules. He makes rules for our flourishing and our benefit. And freedom is on the other side of the wisdom of his way of life. And it all clicked. All right. So we kind of said at the beginning that there's thousands of different stories. And there's probably parents that are watching that are like, that's really helpful. I started thinking about that and trying to get on that train in the last 6 months. But I've been a parent for 15 years, and my kid is... What would you say to someone who's listening, who's like, that's great, that's ideal, but it's kind of gone off the rails a little bit, and I have a kid who just doesn't... Maybe there's a little bit of relationship, but they're not really listening to me. I want more influence, but I'm not there right now. What would you say to parents on that side who it's not going great and they want to move towards a healthier picture of this? What would you say to them?
Yeah, obviously it needs to start with prayer. Like you're just constantly praying for your kid. You can't go back and rewind and change things because what was happened, all those things. but you start praying, and then you start changing yourself, and allowing the Holy Spirit to change who you are, and your kids will start seeing difference in you. Now, I'm not saying by all that happening 1 + 1 is going to equal 2, but when the kids start seeing the gospel transform you, then it's like, okay, you're legit in this, and so you can't, there's a lot of baggage you still have to work yourself through, but having those conversations can heal over time.
That's great.
Yeah, and even the conversations of, like straightforward with them, like, what's going on, seeking their heart. Sometimes it's parenting always feels like it's supposed to be discipline or whatever, and it's like seeking, what they're going through and being understanding to that. It's hard because it's like you want to fix it. But sometimes they just want to vent, or just, talk or whatever. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes you're not the person, and I've prayed for people to be in my kids' life, that would have the same voice as I have, because there comes a point where they don't, I remember my daughter coming to me and saying, "Oh, so-and-so said this." And it was like, I've said that and she heard it, but she heard it from somebody, and it was like, it was an answer to prayer because it's exactly what I want,
Yeah.
Yeah, how many times Greg Foot has been the person I've heard that about? Like, I'll sit there and they're like, Pastor Greg said this, and Jennifer and I are like, you gotta be kidding me, But I think what you said is so important. Having other adults in our lives is important.
Widen the circle.
Shannon Foot said the other part of it.
Yeah. I think a parent that's gone through that too, I don't know, like everybody's got different stories.
Right.
There's several things I think when I sit with a parent like that. One is there's no perfect parent.
Oh.
And I think you can take too much credit when things are going great and too much responsibility when they're not. Something that was powerful that I read, I don't remember who I read it from, it's not original to me, but it said when it comes to discipline and conflict, all that, don't see yourself as much as fighting with your child. See yourself as fighting with against sin with your child. So the fight isn't against your child. Because what that does is sets up, like, you're the enemy, but what I want to do is stand with my child and fight against sin or whatever that might be. Because if you think about it, parenting is, if we're going to do it in the way the gospel pictures, is one of the most incredibly selfless. You're doing things, we don't have arbitrary rules. We're doing it for their benefit.
Yeah.
And what we want to do is set ourselves to fight against sin with our kid. And so if they're not listening to us, maybe they're at an age where that I've lost that opportunity, I would want them to know this. Like, if a parent was asking this, make sure your kid knows that there's nothing they're going to do that's going to make you love them more. Nothing you're going to make them to love you less. Like, so they may be going all over the place, but let them know my love for you, that's consistent. I don't agree, I don't whatever. And I would just make sure there was a security in that. Like, if they're 16 and you're like, okay, we're just trying to get a handle on this thing, and we didn't have any of these principles in play when they were younger, certainly there's a different challenge there.
Yeah.
Right? But I think if you start from the aspect, we love you, I love you, I'm for you, versus, we're going to do this new thing and set these new rules in place, like, that's surefire way for disaster.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I would just, everything I could, reinforce the relationship. We said Sunday, rules without relationship usually leads to rebellion.
Yeah.
No matter what age the kid. Sometimes you can have the relationship and there's still rebellion. And I think it's important for whoever's listening to us to hear that.
Yeah.
I know some wonderful parents whose children decided to do everything different than they were taught. And, I think parents can take too much responsibility for that. You prayerfully, as he was saying, prayerfully go before God with your kid. our kids are on loan to us from God.
Yeah.
It's an interesting way to look at it, right? I think when I get all wrapped up in how they turned out, I probably idolized them. I heard somebody say this morning, like, if my kids turn out and it goes to my head, I probably idolize them. If they didn't turn out and it just crushes and destroys my heart, I probably idolize them. That's an interesting way to look at it, right? Like, I want to do my best in disciplining and discipling and coaching. I want to make sure they know they're loved by me, that there's a God who loves them way more than I do. At the end of the day, they're volitional little beings.
Yeah.
You know, they make a decision, and I can do all. I know parents that didn't do anything the way we would talk about, and their kids are like the Apostle Paul. You know, like, well, how'd that happen? I don't know. God just intervened in a unique way. You know.
Yeah.
So I think I'd be careful of taking too much responsibility, but I'd make sure I told them I loved them. I'd want them to know that. You might be doing everything different than we would suggest or tell you. I love you. And then I would seek help. A parent who's in that situation needs to find safe community. That's where I think the church is helpful, you know, to not just programs at the church, but the people. We need community. We need each other.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just hard to be a parent.
Oh, yeah.
Just hard.
I don't know, you guys talking about it's pretty easy so far for me. The sarcasm didn't translate. No. Hey, so Sunday you talked a lot about parenting and kind of this call to nurture. So it's creating the environment, it's having the conversations, it's understanding influence and control, all those things. Before we close, I kind of want to talk about this for a minute. And that passage talks about children obeying your parents. There's almost this honor of children to parents. Now, I'm not sure how many 7-year-olds are listening to this podcast. You know, that may not be our audience. But for maybe maybe it's high school, college age, adults who are walking through aging parents or whatever it may be, what would you guys say are some of the practical ways that honor shows up? Because it's almost, you hear that passage, you know, children honor your parents, like, yeah, so listen when I talk to you, 7-year-old. What does that look like as we get older and go through different stages, as that kind of starts to flip? What does honor look like practically, would you guys say?
I mean, I think practically it's just, you know, you're helping out. Like if you're, I mean, if you have an aging parent who maybe has, I mean, this is this time of year, but a bunch of leaves in their yard, like, do you mow or rake? Like you just show honor that, so you don't need to be out there doing that. You've done your time, and how can I help you along those ways? And so honoring them just by tangible acts of service to show that you honor and respect them that way.
I think that's a loaded question, because people who are watching this, stories are all over. Like, I think about the adult whose parent was just neglectful and it was really hard upbringing, and they hear that. I thought about these people Sunday. They hear honor your parents. They're like,
yeah, go there. That was the last thing I wanted to ask, was go there for a second. People that are listening, that are just like, yeah, so there's the parenting side, but then the honoring my parents' side, and it's like, man, you have no idea what this was like. Unfruitful, unhelpful, unhealthy, unsafe. What would you say to people in that boat?
yeah, I think that, Aiden, the thing that comes to my mind is, if I'm assuming I'm talking to somebody asking the question who's a follower of Jesus, and a follower of Jesus responds out of a response of worship. So I can either respond out of the way my parents treated me, and that's going to elicit one response, or I can respond out of the way I've been treated by the Father in heaven to my parents, and that's worship. And when I realize that God loves me when I was unlovable, pursued me when I was an enemy of God, all of a sudden it changes. So what I would say is, for the person in that boat, several things. I would stop dehumanizing your parents to the extent you might be doing that, and begin seeing in them the image of God. That they are an image bearer, that they're a person, and that for whatever reason they treat you the way they did, and begin responding to them out of response to the gospel as an image bearer, somebody who God's placed in your life, just happens to be your parent. And the other thing I would say is to just acknowledge the uniform they wear. You know, they're your parent, and you can't unparent them. They're your parent. I realize you can divorce your parents, I guess, nowadays, or whatever, but God placed them in your life. And I really think one way would be just to try to build a relationship with them. You don't have to be okay with the way they treated you. Sometimes you might find that there's a story that would not excuse what they did, but might explain it.
Mm-hmm.
And to think that they might find the healing, redemptive work of Christ would be quite a blessing. And so I think honoring them isn't like, oh man, I'm okay, I'm going to overlook, I was treated this way.
Sure.
I think honoring them is responding to God in worship, all he's done for me, to the parents that I have. If they were great, that's one thing, but if they weren't, I can still respond to them as an image bearer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which in and of itself, that is the heart of the gospel, and forgiveness is always likely to pull up a lot of pain, but that the lens to which Paul is writing this whole section is submitting to one another out of reverence, out of worship for Jesus, that we worship Jesus and we navigate those relationships in a particular way. We could do this all day long and ask questions all day long. There's tons of resources within just Grace Church. I'm sure anybody has any questions, emailing, reaching out to you guys. You guys would love to sit down and have coffee. I hate coffee. Greg hates coffee. Maybe have Coke with somebody. Coffee with Sherry, Coke with Greg. But just having questions, navigating, everybody's story is different. And so if you maybe listen to this, these guys would love to have a conversation with you. But I think we'll kind of keep some of these. There's a lot of nitty-gritty things in this parenting world, family world, that just kind of deserve their own episode. Each one of those questions could deserve their own. I have a feeling that as we kind of keep navigating that, we'll kind of keep doing this. So thanks for sitting down with us today, kind of bringing your experience to us as we kind of offer us some wisdom. It's fun.
Thank you.
Thanks, man. You did great.